6 months after the incident, the Golden Crown had undergone significant changes under Margaret's leadership. The restaurant implemented new hiring practices that prioritized diversity and inclusion, bringing in staff from various backgrounds to better reflect the community they served. The training programs introduced after the incident had become a model that other establishments began to adopt. Robert, the former maitre d', never returned to the restaurant industry. The incident had exposed attitudes and behaviors that made him unsuitable for customer-facing roles in hospitality. Marcus, the doorman, was also terminated and struggled to find similar employment as word of his discriminatory behavior spread throughout the industry. Emma, the young server who had spoken out about what she witnessed, was promoted to a supervisory role and became involved in the restaurant's new diversity initiatives. Her courage in standing up for what was right had earned her respect from both management and colleagues, leading to new opportunities for advancement. James continued his duties as a royal protection officer, but the incident had changed him in subtle ways. He became more aware of the discrimination that others faced and began speaking at diversity training sessions for security personnel. His experience had given him a unique perspective on how prejudice could affect even those in positions of authority and responsibility. The legal case that Sarah had prepared was eventually settled out of court, with the Golden Crown agreeing to substantial financial compensation and a formal apology. More importantly for James, the settlement included requirements for ongoing monitoring of the restaurant's practices and regular reporting on diversity initiatives. Margaret's efforts to rebuild the restaurant's reputation gradually began to show results. The Golden Crown became known not just for its fine dining, but also for its commitment to equality and inclusion. While some traditional customers were lost, new patrons appreciated the establishment's transformation and the principles it now embodied. The incident led to broader changes in the hospitality industry, with trade associations developing new guidelines for preventing discrimination. The Golden Crown case was frequently cited in training materials and legal discussions about equality and public accommodations. The impact extended far beyond a single restaurant or evening. James and Sarah eventually married in a small ceremony, attended by colleagues from both the palace and Sarah's law firm. The incident that had brought such stress to their relationship ultimately strengthened their bond as they worked together to address the injustice they had faced. Their shared experience of discrimination had deepened their understanding of each other and their commitment to fighting prejudice. Chief Inspector Williams used the incident as a teaching moment within the Royal Protection Unit, emphasizing the importance of supporting officers who faced discrimination while off duty. New protocols were developed to ensure that such incidents would be handled consistently and that officers would receive appropriate support and advocacy from their superiors. The media attention gradually faded, but the lessons learned from the incident continued to resonate. James occasionally received messages from other people who had faced similar discrimination, thanking him for bringing attention to these issues. His unwitting role as a symbol of the fight against prejudice was something he never sought, but came to accept as part of his legacy. 2 years later, James was invited to speak at a conference on diversity in law enforcement and security services. His presentation about the restaurant incident and its aftermath was met with standing ovations from an audience of professionals who understood the courage it took to stand up against discrimination while maintaining one's dignity and professionalism. The Golden Crown eventually regained its 3 Michelin stars, but more importantly, it earned recognition as one of London's most inclusive fine dining establishments. Margaret often reflected on how the worst crisis in her restaurant's history had ultimately led to its greatest transformation. The incident had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her business and society at large. Emma went on to study hospitality management at university, inspired by her experience to pursue a career focused on creating inclusive dining environments. She often spoke about the importance of staff members having the courage to speak up when they witnessed discrimination, emphasizing that silence was complicity in perpetuating injustice. The incident at the Golden Crown became a case study in business schools and law schools, illustrating the costs of discrimination and the importance of inclusive practices. Students analyzed how a single evening's poor decisions had led to lasting consequences for all involved, while also examining the positive changes that emerged from the crisis. James never forgot the lessons of that evening, but he also never let the discrimination he faced define him or limit his aspirations. He continued to serve with distinction, eventually earning promotion to a senior position within the Royal Protection Unit. His experience had taught him that dignity and professionalism could triumph over prejudice, but only when good people were willing to stand up and fight for what was right. The story of the Royal Guard who was denied entry to a 5-star restaurant became more than just a news story about discrimination. It became a powerful reminder that change was possible when people of conscience refused to accept injustice, and that even the most established institutions could be transformed when confronted with the truth about their practices. The next morning, James woke to find that the incident at the Golden Crown had become front-page news in several British newspapers. Social media coverage had exploded overnight, with thousands of people sharing their outrage about the treatment of a royal protection officer. The story had struck a nerve with the public, highlighting ongoing issues of discrimination in upscale establishments. Buckingham Palace issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the incident and expressing confidence in their security personnel's professionalism. While the palace did not directly criticize the restaurant, their support for James was clear. The statement emphasized that royal protection officers serve with distinction and deserve respect while performing their duties and during their personal time. James found himself at the center of a media storm he had never wanted or anticipated. Phone calls from journalists, interview requests, and messages of support flooded his personal phone and work email. The attention was overwhelming for someone who had spent his career working behind the scenes to protect others rather than being in the spotlight himself. The Golden Crown faced immediate consequences as the story spread. Several high-profile customers canceled their reservations, citing their unwillingness to dine at an establishment that had demonstrated discriminatory practices. Food critics began questioning whether they should continue recommending a restaurant that had shown such poor judgment in its treatment of guests. Margaret Ashworth worked frantically to manage the crisis, hiring a public relations firm to help address the negative publicity. However, she quickly learned that the court of public opinion was less forgiving than she had hoped. The restaurant's exclusive reputation, which had once been an asset, now worked against them as people questioned what other discriminatory practices might be hidden behind closed doors. Emma, the young server who had witnessed the incident, was interviewed by several news outlets about what she had observed. Her account provided crucial first-hand testimony about the discriminatory treatment James had received. Emma's courage in speaking out, despite potential consequences for her employment, earned her widespread praise and support. The incident prompted broader discussions about discrimination in the hospitality industry. Other customers began sharing their own experiences of being denied service or treated poorly at upscale establishments because of their race, appearance, or perceived social status. The Golden Crown incident had opened a larger conversation about equality and access in British society. James received an unexpected phone call from the Queen's private secretary, conveying Her Majesty's personal appreciation for his years of dedicated service and her regret that he had been subjected to such treatment. The monarch's acknowledgement of the situation, while private, meant a great deal to James and demonstrated the palace's support for their personnel. Margaret made the difficult decision to implement comprehensive diversity and inclusion training for all staff members. She also revised the restaurant's policies to ensure that dress code and service standards were applied consistently and fairly to all customers. While these changes were necessary, they came at significant cost and required admitting that problems had existed. The story reached international media, with news outlets around the world reporting on the incident. The irony of a protector of the British Crown being denied service at a restaurant named the Golden Crown was not lost on international observers. The incident became a symbol of the persistent challenges facing minorities in traditionally white, upper-class spaces. Legal experts weighed in on the potential consequences for the restaurant, explaining that discrimination in public accommodations violated equality laws. While James had not yet decided whether to pursue legal action, the possibility remained open and added to the pressure on the establishment to make meaningful changes. Sarah used her legal expertise to document everything that had happened, preserving evidence in case they decided to file a formal complaint. Her professional training had been invaluable in ensuring that the incident was properly recorded and that James's rights were protected. Throughout the ordeal, the incident also prompted discussions within the Royal Protection Unit about protocols for off-duty officers. While James had done nothing wrong, the situation highlighted the unique challenges faced by those who serve in high-profile security roles. Some consideration was given to whether additional guidance should be provided to help officers navigate such situations. Restaurant industry organizations began reviewing their own guidance about service standards and discrimination prevention. The Golden Crown incident had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of allowing prejudice to influence business decisions. Many establishments reviewed their policies to ensure they could withstand similar scrutiny. James struggled with the unwanted attention the incident had brought to his personal life. As someone who valued privacy and had chosen a career that typically kept him out of public view, the media coverage was uncomfortable and intrusive. He found himself questioning whether the evening out had been worth the consequences that followed. The support James received from colleagues, friends, and the general public was overwhelming and heartening. Messages poured in from people who had faced similar discrimination, as well as from those who simply wanted to express their appreciation for his service. The incident had revealed both the worst and best of human nature in the responses it generated. The restaurant owner, Margaret Ashworth, arrived at the Golden Crown 30 minutes after receiving an urgent call from her management team. She had built the establishment over 20 years into one of London's most prestigious dining venues, and the last thing she wanted was a scandal that could damage its reputation. Margaret had been attending a charity auction when her assistant reached her with news of the situation. As Margaret entered the lobby, she immediately assessed the scene before her. Police officers were taking statements, several customers were recording video with their phones, and her staff looked anxious and uncertain. The tension in the room was palpable, and she could see that her restaurant's usually serene atmosphere had been completely disrupted. Margaret quickly spoke with Robert to understand what had transpired. As she listened to his explanation of the dress code violation, she became increasingly uncomfortable with his reasoning. Having built her business on providing exceptional service to all guests, she recognized that something had gone seriously wrong in how this situation had been handled. The owner then approached James and Sarah directly, introducing herself and apologizing for the inconvenience they had experienced. Her tone was genuine, reflecting her growing understanding that her staff had made a serious error in judgment. Margaret had worked hard to build relationships with influential clients, and she understood the potential consequences of mistreating someone with connections to Buckingham Palace. James accepted her apology graciously, but made it clear that the issue went beyond simple inconvenience. He explained that he had been subjected to discriminatory treatment, despite meeting all stated requirements for dining at the establishment. Sarah added that the incident appeared to be based on racial bias rather than any legitimate policy concerns. Margaret requested to see James's reservation confirmation and official credentials, which he provided without hesitation. As she examined the documents, she realized that her staff had turned away a paying customer who was not only properly dressed, but also held an important position in royal security. The implications for her business were becoming increasingly clear. The owner then spoke privately with Emma, the young server who had witnessed the entire incident. Emma provided an honest account of what she had observed, including her assessment that James was dressed appropriately and that other less formally dressed customers had been seated without question. Her testimony confirmed Margaret's growing suspicion that discrimination had occurred. Chief Inspector Williams called the restaurant again, this time speaking directly with Margaret. The conversation was cordial but serious, with Williams emphasizing the importance of the matter from a security perspective. He explained that royal protection officers needed to be able to move freely in public without facing discrimination, as such treatment could potentially compromise their effectiveness. Margaret found herself facing a crisis that threatened everything she had worked to build. The Golden Crown's reputation was based on exclusivity and impeccable service, but the current situation was exposing ugly prejudices that contradicted those values. She realized that immediate action was needed to address the situation and prevent further damage to her establishment. The police officers completed their investigation and determined that no crime had been committed by James or Sarah. However, Sergeant Thompson made it clear to Margaret that the incident could potentially be reported as discriminatory behavior, which might result in an investigation by equality authorities. The legal implications added another layer of concern for the restaurant owner. Social media was beginning to pick up the story as some of the witness videos were shared online. The hashtag #RoyalGuardDenied started trending as people expressed outrage about the treatment James had received. The power of social media meant that the incident was rapidly spreading beyond the confines of the restaurant, potentially reaching thousands of people within hours. Margaret made the decision to personally escort James and Sarah to the best table in the restaurant and ensure they received exceptional service for the remainder of the evening. She instructed her entire staff to treat them as VIP guests and made it clear that their meal would be complimentary. While this gesture was appreciated, it could not undo the humiliation and discrimination they had already experienced. The other diners in the restaurant were acutely aware of the situation that had unfolded in the lobby. Some approached James during the evening to express their support and apologize for what they had witnessed. Others seemed uncomfortable with the attention the incident had brought to the establishment, preferring to maintain the illusion of refined dining without confronting difficult realities. Robert, the maitre d', was suspended pending a full investigation into his handling of the situation. Marcus, the doorman, was also placed on administrative leave while the restaurant reviewed its policies and training procedures. Margaret realized that she needed to take comprehensive action to address the systemic issues that had allowed such discrimination to occur. As James and Sarah finally sat down to their long-awaited dinner, the events of the evening had transformed what should have been a romantic celebration into a sobering reminder of the prejudice that still existed in society. Despite the eventual resolution, the impact of the discrimination they had faced could not be easily forgotten or dismissed. The police arrived within 15 minutes, 2 officers responding to what had been reported as a disturbance at the upscale restaurant. Constable Davies and Sergeant Thompson entered the lobby, expecting to find the usual situation of intoxicated customers refusing to leave. Instead, they found a well-dressed couple standing calmly while restaurant staff hovered nervously nearby. Sergeant Thompson immediately recognized the tension in the room and began gathering information from all parties involved. When James presented his palace credentials, both officers examined them carefully. Sergeant Thompson had worked security for royal events in the past and was familiar with the official identification carried by palace protection officers. The police officers found themselves in an unusual position. Robert continued to insist that James and Sarah were trespassing and should be removed from the premises, but the officers could see no evidence of any wrongdoing or disturbance. James and Sarah had remained calm and polite throughout the encounter. While the restaurant staff appeared increasingly agitated, Constable Davies began questioning Robert about the specific dress code violations that had led to James being denied entry. When pressed for details, Robert became evasive, unable to point to any particular aspect of James's appearance that violated restaurant policy. The officer noted that James was dressed more formally than many other patrons visible through the dining room windows. Meanwhile, Chief Inspector Williams at Buckingham Palace had begun making phone calls of his own. The treatment of one of his officers while carrying official credentials was a serious matter that could have implications for palace security protocols. Williams contacted the restaurant directly, asking to speak with the manager about the incident involving his officer. The call from Buckingham Palace was transferred to Robert, who initially assumed it was a prank. When the caller identified himself as Chief Inspector Williams and provided official palace contact information for verification, Robert's confident demeanor began to crack. The reality that James might actually be telling the truth about his position started to sink in. Williams explained to Robert that James Mitchell was indeed a serving royal protection officer who had been on duty earlier that evening. He emphasized that palace credentials were not issued lightly and that James had undergone extensive background checks and security clearances. The chief inspector's tone was professional but unmistakably serious as he questioned why one of his officers was being denied service. While Robert was on the phone with Williams, Sarah continued documenting the incident with her phone, recording the ongoing discrimination for potential legal action. Several other diners had also begun filming, recognizing that they were witnessing something that might become newsworthy. The incident was beginning to take on a life of its own. Emma, the young server who had been watching the entire situation unfold, finally approached one of the police officers. She quietly explained that she had served other customers that evening, who were dressed less formally than James, and that she had never seen the restaurant's dress code applied so strictly before. Her testimony provided important context for the officers' assessment of the situation. The police officers began to understand that they were dealing with a case of discrimination rather than a simple trespassing matter. Sergeant Thompson had seen similar situations before and recognized the patterns of behavior that suggested racial bias. The restaurant's inability to provide specific dress code violations, combined with James's obvious adherence to formal dress standards, painted a clear picture. Robert returned from his phone call looking pale and shaken. The conversation with Chief Inspector Williams had made it clear that James was indeed who he claimed to be, and that the palace was now aware of the situation. Williams had politely but firmly requested that the restaurant extend every courtesy to Officer Mitchell, while making it clear that any mistreatment of palace personnel would be taken very seriously. The maitre d' found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His initial confidence in his decision to deny James entry had evaporated in the face of official palace involvement and police scrutiny. The exclusive restaurant that prided itself on discretion was now the center of a very public incident that was being recorded by multiple witnesses. Other customers continued to watch the drama unfold, with some clearly uncomfortable about dining at an establishment that was demonstrating such obvious discrimination. The restaurant's reputation for providing a refined dining experience was being overshadowed by the ugly scene in the lobby. Several tables had requested their bills early, choosing to leave rather than continue their meals. James remained remarkably composed throughout the ordeal, his military and security training evident in his calm demeanor. However, Sarah could see the impact the situation was having on him. This was a man who had devoted his career to public service and protecting others, yet he was being treated as if he were a threat or nuisance simply for trying to enjoy a dinner out. The incident had now involved multiple police officers, palace security officials, and numerous witnesses. What had started as a simple dinner reservation had become a significant confrontation that would have lasting consequences for everyone involved. The stage was set for a resolution that would force the restaurant to confront the reality of their discriminatory practices. James decided to take a different approach. Speaking in the calm, measured tone he used during official duties, he explained that he was a royal protection officer who had just finished a security detail at Buckingham Palace. He showed his official credentials to Robert, hoping that his position might carry some weight with the establishment. Robert examined the identification card with skepticism, turning it over in his hands as if looking for signs that it might be fake. The gold-embossed royal crest and James's official photograph were clearly visible, along with his security clearance level and palace contact information. However, Robert seemed more interested in finding reasons to doubt the credentials than in accepting their authenticity. The maitre d' handed the identification back to James with a dismissive shrug, stating that anyone could print fake cards these days. He suggested that even if the credentials were real, it did not change the restaurant's dress code policy. Robert's tone had become increasingly condescending, as if he were speaking to a child trying to pull a prank. Sarah could no longer contain her outrage. As a lawyer, she was well versed in discrimination law and began citing specific statutes that prohibited businesses from refusing service based on race. Her voice carried clearly through the restaurant's lobby, causing more diners to stop and listen. Some looked ashamed of what they were witnessing, while others seemed annoyed that their expensive evening was being interrupted. A young server named Emma, who had been watching the confrontation from behind the reception desk, looked increasingly uncomfortable. She had worked at the restaurant for 6 months and had never seen the management treat a customer so poorly. Emma could see that James was impeccably dressed and obviously well educated, making the doorman's claims about dress code violations seem absurd. Marcus. The doorman began to realize that the situation was escalating beyond his control. He had initially assumed that James would simply leave when denied entry, as many people did when faced with such treatment. However, James's calm persistence and Sarah's legal knowledge were creating a scene that was drawing unwanted attention to the restaurant's practices. Robert made the decision to call the police, claiming that James and Sarah were causing a disturbance and refusing to leave private property. This escalation shocked several of the watching diners, who began to murmur among themselves about the appropriateness of the restaurant's response. A middle-aged businessman who had been dining with his wife quietly asked for his bill, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. While they waited for the police to arrive, James noticed that his phone had several missed calls from his supervisor at the palace. During high-profile events, royal protection officers were required to remain available even after their shifts ended, in case additional security concerns arose. James stepped aside to return the call, speaking quietly to Chief Inspector Williams about the evening's charity gala. The conversation was brief and professional, with James reporting that all security protocols had been followed successfully during the Queen's appearance. However, when Chief Inspector Williams asked about James's current location, James hesitated before explaining the situation at the restaurant. He was embarrassed to admit that he was being denied service despite his official position and proper attire. Chief Inspector Williams listened with growing disbelief as James described the events. As head of the Queen's Personal Protection Unit, Williams had worked with James for years and knew him to be one of the most professional and reliable officers on the team. The idea that James was being treated this way while carrying official palace credentials was both insulting and potentially problematic from a security perspective. Emma, the young server, finally decided to speak up. She approached Robert quietly and suggested that perhaps they should reconsider their position, pointing out that other customers were beginning to leave due to the uncomfortable atmosphere. She mentioned that she had served several other patrons that evening, who were dressed less formally than James, making the dress code excuse seem hollow. Robert dismissed Emma's concerns with an impatient wave, telling her to focus on her own duties and let management handle the situation. His dismissive attitude toward his own employee only reinforced Sarah's growing conviction that the restaurant's behavior was rooted in prejudice rather than legitimate policy. Concerns, the tension in the lobby, continued to build as other diners whispered among themselves about what they were witnessing. Some pulled out their phones to record the incident, recognizing that they might be documenting something significant. The restaurant's reputation for exclusivity was beginning to work against it. As the contrast between their treatment of James and their usual obsequious service to wealthy patrons became increasingly obvious. James maintained his composure throughout the ordeal, but Sarah could see the hurt and frustration in his eyes. This was a man who had dedicated his career to serving his country and protecting the crown, yet he was being treated as if he were unworthy of basic respect and service. The injustice of the situation was becoming more apparent to everyone present with each passing minute. James Mitchell had served Queen Elizabeth II for 12 years as one of her most trusted personal protection officers. His days were filled with carefully planned security details, diplomatic events, and the constant responsibility of keeping the monarch safe. On this particular Tuesday evening in May 2019, James found himself in an unusual situation. The Queen had attended a private charity gala in central London, and after ensuring her safe departure back to Buckingham Palace, James was finally off duty, still wearing his formal dark suit and polished black shoes that marked him as palace security. James decided to treat himself to a nice dinner. He had been working 14-hour days for the past week, and his girlfriend Sarah had been understanding about their canceled dinner plans. Tonight, he wanted to make it up to her by taking her somewhere special. James chose the Golden Crown, a prestigious 5-star restaurant in Mayfair, known for its exceptional cuisine and elegant atmosphere. The establishment had earned 3 Michelin stars and was frequented by celebrities, politicians, and wealthy business people. James had saved for months to afford this dinner, wanting to celebrate Sarah's recent promotion at the law firm where she worked. When James arrived at the restaurant at 8 o'clock, he was still carrying his official palace identification and security credentials. The restaurant's exterior was impressive, with large windows revealing glimpses of crystal chandeliers and well-dressed diners inside. A doorman in a burgundy uniform stood at the entrance, greeting guests with practiced politeness. Sarah was already waiting inside the lobby, looking beautiful in a navy blue dress she had bought specifically for this occasion. She smiled when she saw James approaching, but her expression quickly changed to confusion when she noticed the doorman stepping forward to block James's path. The doorman, whose name tag read Marcus, looked James up and down with obvious disapproval. Despite James's neat appearance and formal attire, Marcus seemed to find something objectionable about him. James was tall and athletic, with the confident bearing that came from years of military and security training. But he was also a young black man in an establishment that rarely saw diversity among its clientele. Marcus cleared his throat and spoke in a tone that was polite on the surface but carried an unmistakable edge of disdain. He informed James that the restaurant had a strict dress code and that his current attire was not suitable for dining. James looked down at his perfectly pressed suit, confused by the statement. He was dressed more formally than many of the other patrons he could see through the windows. Sarah stepped forward, her legal training immediately recognizing what was happening. She politely but firmly asked Marcus to clarify exactly which aspect of James's appearance violated the dress code. The doorman became flustered, unable to point to any specific item of clothing that was inappropriate. Instead, he mumbled something about the restaurant's policies and suggested they try somewhere else. Other guests began to notice the commotion. A well-dressed elderly couple paused their conversation to stare, and the maître d' emerged from inside the restaurant to see what was causing the disturbance. James felt his face growing warm with embarrassment and anger, but his training had taught him to remain calm under pressure. The maître d', a thin man with silver hair named Robert Thornfield, approached with an air of authority. He had worked at the Golden Crown for over 20 years and prided himself on maintaining the restaurant's exclusive atmosphere. Without asking for details about the situation, he immediately supported his doorman's decision, stating that the restaurant reserved the right to refuse service to anyone. James pulled out his reservation confirmation on his phone, showing that he had booked a table for 2 weeks in advance and had even paid a deposit. Robert barely glanced at the screen before dismissing it, claiming that having a reservation did not guarantee entry if dress code requirements were not met. The irony was not lost on James that he was being denied entry to a restaurant called the Golden Crown while carrying credentials identifying him as a protector of the actual crown. Sarah's voice began to rise as she pointed out the obvious discrimination taking place. She threatened to call the police and file a complaint with the local council about the restaurant's practices. Several other diners had now gathered to watch the scene unfold, some looking uncomfortable, while others seemed to be enjoying the drama. James placed a gentle hand on Sarah's arm, silently asking her to let him handle the situation. He had faced prejudice before in his life, but never while representing the highest office in the land. The contrast between his role protecting the Queen and being treated as unworthy of entering a restaurant was almost surreal.